Chapter 1. The Mystery of Trauma and the Body's Wisdom. If you are suffering from inexplicable symptoms, night terrors, chronic pain, sudden panics, or a pervasive sense of invisible weight, you are not broken and you are certainly not losing your mind. There is a profound, rational, and biological explanation for the agonies that haunt you. For centuries, the philosophy of healing has suffered from a grievous fracture, treating the mind and the body as if they were entirely separate domains. We are told to talk our way out of our mental anguish or medicate our physical pain, yet this reductionist approach ignores a fundamental truth recognized long ago by the philosopher Spinoza. Whatever impacts the body's power of action simultaneously alters the mind, and whatever limits the mind inevitably binds the body. When a person encounters an overwhelming, life-threatening event, the mind alters its state to protect the psyche, often retreating into denial or a hazy detachment. Simultaneously, the physical body braces for impact, tensing in absolute terror and often collapsing into a state of profound immobility. While the mind may eventually return to its normal state of awareness, the body frequently remains trapped in its bracing, unable to complete the restorative process. When this physical release is thwarted, the lingering effects harden into fixation, and the individual becomes traumatized. To truly understand and ultimately conquer this affliction, we must look beyond the realm of traditional psychology and turn to the natural world. Trauma is not a permanent disease, nor is it a life sentence of inescapable pathology. Rather, it is a highly evolved, natural survival process that has simply gone awry. Embedded deep within our biology is an innate, instinctual wisdom that knows exactly how to heal from catastrophic experiences. This wisdom is not accessed through the rational, thinking mind, but through the living, sensing organism. It is a biological fluency that we share with every wild creature on Earth. Picture a herd of impala grazing peacefully in a lush, sunlit valley. Suddenly, the wind shifts, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of a predator. Instantly, the entire herd tenses, their nervous systems heightened to a hair-trigger state of alertness. They pause, sniffing the air, ears swiveling to locate the danger. When a cheetah bursts from the dense shrubbery, the herd moves as a single fluid organism darting toward the safety of the thicket. But one young impala trips. In a blur of motion, the cheetah lunges and the chase reaches a blazing 70 miles an hour. Just a fraction of a second before the predator's claws make contact, the young impala collapses to the ground, surrendering completely to its impending death. It is not playing a conscious trick or pretending to be dead. Instead, it has involuntarily entered a profound, altered state of consciousness, a deep biological immobility response shared by all mammals when death is absolutely certain. Nature designed this freezing response for two brilliant reasons. First, it serves as a last-ditch survival strategy. Predators are stimulated by the chase. They often lose interest in dead prey, or they may drag the limp body to a safe lair to be eaten later. This delay can provide the frozen animal with a brief window of opportunity to suddenly awaken and flee. Second, this immobility induces an intense analgesic trance. If the impala is to be torn apart, the numbing chemistry of the freeze ensures that it will not feel the excruciating pain of its own destruction. While modern human societies frequently judge this instinctual surrender as cowardice or weakness, it is, in reality, a profound gift from the wild. We shrink from the immobility response because it mimics the absolute stillness of death, yet our failure to embrace and move through this physiological state is the very reason we suffer from trauma. The key to unlocking the chains of trauma lies precisely in this primitive biology. Within the human skull resides a triune brain, the rational neocortex, the emotional mammalian brain, and the ancient instinctual reptilian core. When we are threatened, it is the reptilian brain that takes command, engaging the identical fight, flight, or freeze mechanisms utilized by the impala. However, unlike the wild animal, human beings carry a complicated evolutionary legacy. Our ancestors were both cunning predators and vulnerable prey, huddled in caves with the constant, terrifying knowledge that they could be snatched in the dark. Consequently, when confronted with a life-threatening situation, our massive, highly developed rational brains often second-guess our primitive instincts. We become caught in a modern Medusa complex, looking the terror of death in the eye and turning to stone. We enter the freezing response but fail to properly exit it. Imagine the internal reality of the young impala that has just collapsed. On the outside, it is stone still, practically indistinguishable from a corpse. But inside, its nervous system is still supercharged, racing at 70 miles an hour. It is the biological equivalent of flooring a car's accelerator while simultaneously slamming on the brakes. The friction between this massive, mobilized survival energy and the absolute physical restraint of the body creates an internal tornado of unfathomable power. In the wild, once the danger is past, an animal will literally shake and tremble, physically discharging this massive energetic storm before simply returning to the herd. Humans, however, lack this fluid adaptation. We override the trembling with our rational minds, insisting that we must hold it together or be strong. As a result, the tornado is trapped inside the body. The residual energy does not simply evaporate. It is corralled into a constellation of bizarre, debilitating symptoms, anxieties, phobias, depressions, and chronic pains. These symptoms are the organism's desperate, unending attempt to manage a hurricane of trapped survival energy. This entrapment can happen to anyone, not just soldiers on a battlefield or victims of horrific abuse. Trauma is insidious and pervasive, often arising from seemingly ordinary events that the body perceives as mortal threats. Consider a mother spending a sunny afternoon at the park with her 5-year-old son. While she turns to retrieve a stray ball, the boy runs into a busy intersection. The mother hears the sudden, violent screech of tires. In that fraction of a second, her heart plummets into her stomach, the blood drains from her extremities, and her legs turn to heavy lead. She pushes blindly through the gathering crowd and collapses over the bloodied, still body of her child. Plunged into a state of profound shock, she frantically, irrationally attempts to piece his torn clothes back together, pressing her chest to his as if she could breathe her own life force into his lungs. Then, an eerie numbness creeps over her. She detaches from the horror of the scene, operating like a hollow shell. This response is undeniably primal. Her nervous system has initiated the ultimate protective freeze. But if she is unable to eventually thaw, if she is told to simply move on and suppress the immense terror of that day, the shock will settle into her tissues and the trauma will dictate the rest of her life. Why do some people emerge from nightmares relatively unscathed, while others are broken by them? In the sweltering summer of 1976, 26 children were kidnapped from a school bus in Chowchilla, California. They were shoved into dark vans, driven to an abandoned quarry, and entombed underground in a buried trailer. For 30 hours, they sat in the suffocating darkness, paralyzed by apathy and apathetic terror. When the roof began to collapse, 14-year-old Bob Barclay sprang into action. Enlisting the help of another boy, he dug a desperate tunnel through the falling earth, eventually leading the entire group to the surface. The other children were so deeply frozen in shock that they had to be aggressively commanded to move, displaying the passive obedience often seen in hostages. Months later, psychiatric studies revealed that nearly all the children suffered from severe, debilitating trauma, except for Bob Barclay. Bob had successfully channeled the massive surge of his survival energy into a focused physical action. He did not remain frozen. He mobilized his life force to fight for his life, thereby preventing his nervous system from being overburdened by trapped terror. This profound truth reveals that the resources needed to heal trauma reside in the exact same instinctual responses that attempt to defend against it. Years ago, a woman named Nancy sought help for debilitating panic attacks that had left her completely housebound. When instructed to simply relax, she instead spiraled into a catastrophic physical panic, her heart racing erratically, her breathing paralyzed. Recognizing the physiological markers of prey trapped by a predator, her therapist had a sudden intuition and shouted that a tiger was leaping at her, commanding her to run. To the astonishment of everyone, Nancy's legs began to thrash in violent running motions. She unleashed a blood-curdling scream and spent the next hour shaking in full-bodied, convulsive waves. As the storm of energy discharged, a memory surfaced. At 3 years old, she had been forcibly strapped to a surgical table and smothered with an ether mask for a tonsillectomy, terrified and entirely unable to move. Her body had resigned to a state of frozen helplessness. By engaging the physical act of fleeing the imaginary tiger 20 years later, Nancy was finally able to discharge the survival energy that had been locked in her muscles since childhood. Her agoraphobia vanished. She had proven that healing does not require enduring the emotional torture of reliving a past event. It requires the physical completion of a thwarted instinctual action. Trauma leaves a mark, but it does not have to be a permanent deformity. When a young tree is wounded, it does not die. It grows around the injury. As the tree matures, the gnarls and burls that form over the damage become testaments to its history, adding exquisite character, strength, and individuality. We, too, possess this incredible capacity to incorporate our wounds and grow more resilient. Yet, the modern medical paradigm often treats trauma as an irreversible brain disease, desperately searching for pharmaceutical suppressants to mute the body's cries. When an individual suffers a traumatic trigger and begins to sweat and shake, medicine steps in to prescribe drugs that stop the trembling. But stopping the trembling is the exact opposite of what the body requires. Imagine a bird that mistakes a pane of glass for open sky and crashes into a window. It drops to the ground, stunned, seemingly dead. A compassionate child gently scoops the bird into their warm hands. In this safe, quiet container, the bird's nervous system begins to thaw. It starts to twitch and then to violently tremble. This is the physiological discharge of the impact. If the bird is allowed to complete this shaking, it will soon reorient to its surroundings, ruffle its feathers, and fly away completely free of trauma. But if the child, acting out of misplaced concern, decides to pet the trembling bird to calm it down, the animal's natural discharge is interrupted. The bird is thrust back into the paralysis of shock, and its internal energy compounds until it literally dies of fright. Human beings are much like the fallen bird. We desperately require the safety, the warmth, and the permission to tremble and shake off the overwhelming impacts of our lives. A physician named Oliver Sacks once wrote of a mathematician suffering from severe weekly migraines. The attacks were agonizing, yet they always concluded with a physiological catharsis, profuse sweating and a deep physical release, followed immediately by days of brilliant, refreshed creative energy. When the doctor prescribed medication to cure the migraines, the physical symptoms stopped, but the man's mathematical genius vanished with them. The suppressive intervention had locked away the creative wellspring hidden within the organism's natural cycle of tension and release. Trauma is not a pathology to be managed. It is an interrupted physical process that desperately seeks its own completion. When we learn to listen to the language of our bodies, when we invite the trembling, honor the physiological storm, and give the organism the time and space it needs to thaw, we do not just survive our traumas, we transform them. The immense trapped energy that once fueled our deepest terrors is reclaimed, returning us to the natural world of ebb and flow, restoring our vitality and awakening an incredible, enduring wisdom. Chapter 2, Understanding the Traumatic Landscape. The descent into trauma often feels like a slow, terrifying slide into madness. Individuals who were once vibrant and highly functioning can suddenly find themselves besieged by a constellation of bizarre and debilitating afflictions. Flashbacks, chronic insomnia, inexplicable panic attacks, spontaneous outbursts of rage, and phantom physical pains become their daily reality. For decades, society has harbored a narrow view of who suffers from these agonies, typically reserving the label of trauma for combat veterans or survivors of horrific, unimaginable abuse. Yet the truth is far more pervasive. Trauma is a universal human experience. It leaves its invisible fingerprints on nearly everyone, weaving itself quietly into the fabric of our daily lives. The darkness it brings is not a permanent life sentence, but escaping it requires us to journey into a strange primeval landscape, the ancient, instinctual territory of our own bodies. To understand our vulnerability, we must recognize that we are navigating a highly complex technological world using a nervous system forged in the prehistoric wild. Our ancestors lived in constant communion with the rhythms of nature, relying entirely on their physical instincts to survive predators and environmental perils. When faced with a threat, their bodies mobilized massive amounts of energy to either fight or flee, and when the danger passed, they physically discharged that energy and returned to a state of balance. Today, however, our survival relies far more on our intellect than on our physical reflexes. We have alienated ourselves from our primal animal nature. When modern crises arise, whether it is a sudden car crash, a violent assault, or a terrifying medical diagnosis, our primitive nervous systems still flood our bodies with immense survival energy. Because societal conditioning teaches us to suppress our physical reactions, to be polite and to remain stoic, we rarely allow our bodies to instinctually release that trapped vitality. We become suspended in a state of suspended terror, neither fully animal nor fully human, making us exceptionally susceptible to the lingering shadows of trauma. The sheer volume of human suffering generated by this disconnect is staggering. Millions of individuals walk through their lives bearing the heavy burdens of unresolved traumatic shock. It stems from violent crimes, domestic abuse, and natural disasters, but it is equally born from seemingly ordinary hidden sources. A difficult birth, the sudden loss of a loved one, a childhood fall, or a severe fever can all leave profound scars on a developing nervous system. Routine medical and dental procedures, particularly those involving anesthesia and physical immobilization, are deeply terrifying to the instinctual body. A child strapped down for a tonsillectomy, suffocating under an ether mask, while surrounded by glaring lights and masked strangers, does not intellectually understand that the procedure is meant to help. On a cellular level, the child's organism perceives a mortal threat, resulting in a profound physiological freeze. If that trapped terror is not addressed, it can manifest decades later as debilitating phobias, chronic stomach pains, or severe anxiety attacks. Living with this trapped energy creates an isolating, personal hell that defies articulation. For the severely traumatized individual, danger is everywhere. The fear is not simply a philosophical contemplation of mortality, it is a visceral, suffocating certainty that death is imminent at every moment. They fear their own anger, the rejection of their peers, and the quiet stillness of the night. They endure heavy, leaden exhaustion, migrating bodily aches, shortness of breath, and a tragic inability to find joy or satisfaction in their achievements. Compounding this agony is the profound lack of understanding from the world around them. Friends and family, uncomfortable with emotional vulnerability, often urge the sufferer to pull themselves together or get on with their life. Doctors, unable to locate a biological disease in their blood tests or x-rays, frequently dismiss the agonizing physical symptoms as psychosomatic or hypochondria. This cultural demand for rapid adjustment and stoic denial forces the victim deeper into isolation, solidifying the trauma and confirming their worst fear, that they are entirely alone and perhaps losing their mind. Why do some individuals shatter under the weight of an experience while others walk away from the exact same event relatively unscathed? The answer lies in a complex matrix of resources and vulnerabilities. The intensity and duration of the threatening event certainly play a role, as does the individual's age and physical constitution. An infant left alone in a freezing room experiences a life-threatening catastrophe, whereas an adult simply puts on a sweater. But even more critical is the presence of resources, both external and internal. External safety, a supportive friend, a secure hiding place, or a loving parent, provides a buffer against overwhelming terror. Internal resources are built upon our historical successes in navigating danger and our access to innate instinctual defense mechanisms. Consider a woman walking alone at night who realizes two men are silently stalking her from the shadows. As her heart races and panic threatens to paralyze her, she does not succumb to the freeze. Instead, her primal instincts take over. Without thinking, she turns and strides boldly and aggressively directly toward one of the men. Startled by her sudden, unexpected display of power, the attackers scatter. Because she was able to fluidly access her instinctual action plan and successfully protect herself, she discharged her survival energy in the moment. She survived the terrifying ordeal without becoming traumatized. When an individual's resources are insufficient and they are engulfed by an overwhelming event, a profound fragmentation occurs. Ancient, indigenous cultures have understood this shattering for millennia. Shamanic traditions across the globe describe the devastation of trauma not as a psychological disorder, but as a loss of the soul. When a person is subjected to unbearable terror or pain, their spirit flees the physical body to survive the ordeal. In the eyes of the shaman, the resulting physical and emotional illnesses are the direct consequence of the victim wandering through life in a state of spiritual limbo. The cure is never an isolated, solitary endeavor. The healing is a communal responsibility. Through rhythmic drumming, dancing, chanting, and collective prayer, the tribe creates a vibrant, protective container, safely coaxing the fractured pieces of the individual's spirit back into their physical home. Interestingly, as the shamanic ritual reaches its crescendo, the afflicted person almost universally begins to violently shake and tremble. The exact physiological discharge of frozen survival energy observed in wild animals escaping the jaws of a predator. While modern Western medicine has achieved miraculous technological advancements, it has largely ignored this holistic, integrated view of healing. We attempt to medicate the brain's chemistry or analyze the mind's thoughts, but we completely bypass the physical vessel that holds the pain. We lack the communal rituals and the societal permission to tremble, weep, and reintegrate. Yet, the underlying principles of the shamanic soul retrieval remain profoundly relevant to our modern recovery. We do not necessarily need a tribal medicine worker to intercede in the spirit realm for us. We possess an immense, innate capacity to initiate our own healing. However, we cannot do it while clinging to the cultural illusion that enduring pain in silence is a badge of honor. True heroism requires the courage to openly acknowledge our wounds, to seek the warmth of supportive allies, and to yield to the gentle biological urges that guide us toward restoration. The journey back to wholeness begins with a conscious decision to reclaim the physical self. Because trauma fundamentally severs the connection between the spirit and the flesh, one of its most common manifestations is a pervasive physical numbness, a feeling of being hollow or disembodied. To invite the exiled soul back into its home, we must slowly and gently reawaken the boundaries of our own skin. This can be as simple as standing beneath the warm, rhythmic pulse of a shower, bringing focused awareness to every inch of the body as the water cascades over the shoulders, the chest, the back, and the legs. By consciously acknowledging each sensation, even if that sensation is numbness or tension, and silently welcoming each part of the body back into existence, we initiate a profound physiological thaw. It is a quiet, deliberate act of rebellion against the paralyzing grip of terror. By learning to inhabit the living, sensing organism once more, we begin to bridge the agonizing chasm between the body and the mind, taking the crucial first steps out of the shadows and back into the vibrant flow of life. Chapter 3. The Language of the Organism, Instinct and the Felt Sense. To master trauma, we must first understand that we cannot confront it head-on. Like the legendary Medusa, trauma is so terrifying and arresting that anyone who looks directly into its eyes will quickly turn to stone. If we attempt to tackle our most overwhelming experiences directly, we will find ourselves seized by the exact same gripping fear that originally defeated us, trapped once again in a state of frightened immobility. In the ancient myth, the hero Perseus was warned by the goddess Athena not to look directly at the Gorgon. Heeding her wisdom, he used his polished shield to view Medusa only in reflection, which allowed him to safely sever her head. From the slain creature's body emerged Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a warrior wielding a golden sword. These mythic elements provide a profound metaphor for the healing journey. The horse represents our grounded, instinctual bodily nature, while its wings symbolize the soaring transformation that comes from true embodiment. The golden sword embodies the ultimate clarity and truth that slices through our paralyzing fears. To vanquish our own internal Medusas, we must fashion our own reflective shields. We do this not by forcing ourselves to relive the agonizing core of our traumas, but by observing their reflection through our natural, instinctual responses. The primary material for this reflective shield is an internal physical awareness known as the felt sense. This is not a mental concept or a cognitive understanding. It is a profoundly physical experience. It is the medium through which we encounter the totality of our sensations, gathering scattered data from the organism and giving it unified meaning. When we look at a beautiful image on a television screen, we are actually looking at thousands of tiny, digitized dots called pixels. If we were to focus solely on the individual dots, the beauty of the complete image would be lost. Similarly, when listening to a symphony, we do not focus exclusively on the isolated notes. Rather, we experience the gestalt of the melody. The felt sense operates in exactly this way, synthesizing the complex, ever-shifting nuances of our internal and external environments. It is much like a stream, moving through a diverse landscape, altering its character in resonance with its surroundings. Where the terrain is steep and rocky, the stream rushes with vigorous turbulence. Out on the open plains, it meanders so slowly, it barely appears to move at all. Our internal awareness shapes itself to the climate of our experiences in the exact same manner. While modern culture places immense value on reading, writing, and intellectual analysis, it provides virtually no education on how to let the body speak its mind. Cultivating the felt sense requires a deliberate, conscious shift away from our habitual distractions. Imagine returning home after a stressful day, dropping onto the couch and instinctively reaching for the television remote to numb the mind. If instead you were to pause and turn your attention inward, you would initially encounter a chaotic buzzing of thoughts, much like a swarm of restless flies. By simply allowing that unpleasant buzzing to exist without fighting it, your awareness would naturally drop beneath the thoughts and locate a physical corresponding tension, perhaps a tightness in the chest or a shallow flutter in the breath. As you sit with that physical tension, you might notice an underlying fatigue, followed by a gentle, rhythmic nodding of the head or a sudden, tingling warmth spreading through the hands. This is the body communicating its state of being. By learning to inhabit this sensory landscape, we invite our fragmented pieces to return home, fostering a deeper sense of grounding, balance, and creativity. Using the felt sense to listen to the organism requires a disposition of absolute gentleness, because trauma forces a disconnection from our internal experience as a means of surviving unbearable pain. Reconnecting with the body's sensations can feel incredibly daunting. It is a powerful realm, and the journey into it must be taken slowly. Attempting to force a connection or demanding immediate emotional release will only overwhelm the nervous system. The most effective approach is to cultivate an attitude of open curiosity, observing whatever arises without analyzing, interpreting, or judging it. If intense sensations or sudden images appear, the goal is merely to notice them and allow them to pass, riding the current of the sensation rather than getting caught in a whirlpool of psychological interpretation. We must also understand how the organism communicates. Unlike the rational mind, which uses literal and logical language, the organism speaks through metaphor and physical imagery. It uses what it already knows to describe what it is experiencing. When tuning into the felt sense, a sensation might be perceived as fuzzy, jagged, or heavy, like lead. Obviously, there are no literal jagged edges or pieces of lead inside the body. The organism is using these physical metaphors to convey the quality of the compressed energy it is holding. Furthermore, because the energetic forces of trauma are immensely powerful, the organism will occasionally communicate the presence of this trapped energy through horrifying internal images. A profound mistake, frequently made by trauma sufferers and therapists alike, is interpreting these visual communications as literal memories. An individual might experience a terrifying image of torture, not because they were literally tortured, but because their organism is utilizing that extreme image to express the sheer magnitude of the terror they felt during a severe childhood medical procedure or a devastating accident. To navigate this successfully, we must differentiate between pure sensation and the cognitive interpretations we attach to it. Sensation and the felt sense require simple awareness. If you pick up an ice cube, your physical senses register several distinct qualities. It is cold, hard, smooth, and perhaps sticky. A moment later, it becomes wet. If you only notice the cold and ignore the wetness, you have an incomplete picture. Internal sensations require the exact same thorough, non-judgmental inventory by simply acknowledging the temperature, weight, movement, and texture of our internal states without leaping to the conclusion that a tightness in the chest means we are having a breakdown. We allow the sensation the space it needs to naturally transform. This transformation is governed by an inherent rhythm, for all biological phenomena occur in natural cycles. You cannot push a river, nor can you force the nervous system to process its trapped energy faster than its innate rhythm dictates. The pace of the physical organism is significantly slower than the frenetic speed at which modern human beings live their daily lives. The very reason trauma takes root is that we do not give our biological rhythms the time they need to reach their natural completion. By attuning to the slow ebb and flow of our bodily sensations and patiently honoring the time it takes for a tight, jagged feeling to gradually melt into a warm, pulsing release, we re-engage the powerful, self-regulating cycles of the natural world. The wild creatures of the earth utilize this rhythm perfectly. Nature has endowed nearly all living animals with virtually identical nervous system responses to the threat of danger, yet only the human animal routinely develops long-term, debilitating trauma. When wild animals face life-threatening events, they undergo massive physiological mobilization. But once the danger has passed, they quickly discharge the survival energy and return to a state of normal functioning. They do not develop chronic anxiety, phobias, or insomnia. To understand why humans suffer so deeply while animals do not, we must look to the ancient architecture of the brain and heed its primal wisdom. Embedded deep within our modern skulls is the reptilian brain, the ancient template from which all higher life evolved. For the reptile, conscious choice does not exist. Every movement is pure instinct. A lizard basking on a log does not contemplate its caloric needs or philosophize about its existence. When an insect crawls near, its tongue flicks out and the prey is gone. It sleeps, eats, freezes, and fights based purely on the dictates of survival. In mammals, this reptilian core is enveloped by the limbic system, which introduces complex social behaviors and emotions. A herd of impala moves as a unified body not just from raw instinct, but from a mammalian understanding of group safety and emotional bonding. In a healthy human, our massive rational neocortex works in harmony with these older brains, adding the capacity for reflection and creativity. However, when we are threatened, it is the reptilian brain that takes command. The key to unlocking trauma is speaking the language of this primitive core, and its only language is physical sensation. To heal, we must reclaim our innate capacity to be one with nature. Consider the profound attunement of a jellyfish or an amoeba. Pulsing and surging through a fluid medium, the amoeba moves in absolute synchronicity with its environment. The slightest change in water toxicity or the presence of food generates an instantaneous, unified response. There is no agonizing deliberation between the external stimulus and the internal reaction. The organism and the environment are one. For a human being, this level of instinctual harmony is most vividly observed in the indigenous tracker. To survive in the wild, the tracker must stay completely present, anchoring his awareness deeply in his felt sense. He becomes so attuned to the animal he is tracking that he can intuitively sense whether the prey is tired, wounded, or hungry. He reads the bent twigs and the compressed snow, feeling a sense of oneness with the creature he pursues. Simultaneously, his internal radar remains highly active, detecting the faint rustle of leaves that might indicate a predator is stalking him. His senses are vibrant. He is relaxed yet completely alert, grounded in a state of profound well-being and readiness. This state of readiness is built upon the foundation of the orienting response. Imagine strolling through an open meadow when a shadow suddenly darts across the periphery of your vision. Instinctively, your body halts its previous motion. Your muscles tense slightly, your eyes widen, and your head turns automatically toward the disturbance to locate and identify it. You did not consciously decide to execute these movements. Your organism initiated them to assess whether the shadow represents danger, food, or something benign. If it is merely a bird passing overhead, the tension melts and you resume your walk. This fundamental involuntary mechanism, what physiologist Ivan Pavlov termed the "what is it" reflex, is the primary means through which all animals tune into their environment. It is the genesis of curiosity, expectancy, and appropriate defense. In the traumatized individual, this vital response becomes shattered. The ability to smoothly orient to a new stimulus is replaced by a rigid, terrifying collapse, preventing the organism from accurately assessing its safety. By slowly reawakening our connection to the felt sense, we invite the return of our animal instincts, allowing us to restore our broken orienting responses and emerge from the shadows of paralysis. Chapter 4. The Threat Response. Fight, flight, or freeze. When a wild animal survives a life-threatening encounter, its return to normal activity is remarkably swift and fluid. Once the predator has abandoned the hunt, the escaping prey does not immediately resume grazing as if nothing happened. Instead, it finds a place of relative safety and allows its body to undergo a profound, involuntary physical release. It trembles, shakes, and breathes deeply, literally sweating out the massive surge of adrenaline and cortisol that had flooded its system. Through this physical discharge, the animal resets its nervous system to a baseline of calm. It seamlessly shakes off the brush with death and re-enters the vibrant stream of its life, completely unburdened by the memory of the terrifying event. The biological loop of survival has been cleanly opened and closed. But when we look at the human animal, we see a tragic divergence from this natural wisdom. We routinely fail to complete this vital biological cycle, and in that failure, we discover the exact mechanism of how biology transforms into pathology. We discover the trap of the freeze response. To understand this entrapment, we must examine the stage that is set the moment a threat is perceived. When danger looms, the nervous system instantly mobilizes an extraordinary amount of energy, preparing the organism to either fight off the attacker or flee to safety. This is a highly active, explosive state. However, if the threat is so overwhelming that neither fighting nor fleeing is possible, if the individual is physically pinned, trapped, or simply outmatched, the nervous system deploys its ultimate final defense. It bypasses the active responses and plunges the organism into a state of profound immobility. The body collapses, the heart rate drops, and a numbing analgesia washes over the mind. This freeze response is an evolutionary masterstroke designed to minimize pain during a fatal attack and occasionally to trick a predator into losing interest in what appears to be dead prey. In the wild, if the animal survives, it will eventually thaw from this freeze, discharging the massive trapped energy through vigorous shaking. But human beings rarely allow themselves to thaw. We remain stuck in the ice. We can place the blame for this tragic entrapment squarely on the human neocortex. Our massive, highly developed rational brain is the crowning achievement of human evolution, granting us the power of complex language, abstract thought, and technological innovation. Yet, in the realm of raw survival, the neocortex is frequently our worst enemy. When the human body attempts to naturally discharge the intense energy of a freeze through shaking, weeping, or trembling, the rational brain instantly interferes. It judges these primal, involuntary movements as signs of weakness, madness, or social embarrassment. The neocortex commands the body to maintain composure, to be brave, and to hide the vulnerability. In doing so, it acts as a powerful brake, clamping down on the instinctual release. The tremendous survival energy that was mobilized for defense is suddenly locked inside the nervous system with nowhere to go. This creates a terrifying internal landscape where fear and immobility become inextricably bound together. In a healthy human life, immobility is not inherently dangerous. We utilize profound states of stillness all the time. When we fall into a deep, restful sleep, when we meditate, or when we surrender to the deep relaxation of a loving embrace. In these states, immobility is coupled with feelings of safety and bliss. But during a traumatic event, immobility is violently coupled with absolute, overwhelming terror. Because the rational brain prevents the discharge of this terror, the nervous system learns to associate any form of stillness or vulnerability with the original threat of death. The traumatized individual becomes terrified of their own internal quiet. They are driven into a state of chronic hyperarousal, constantly moving, constantly scanning for danger, desperate to avoid the feeling of immobility because, to their deeply confused nervous system, immobility now equals annihilation. The experience of the freeze response is, in many ways, like death itself. It is a plunging into the dark, cold abyss of absolute surrender. Therefore, emerging from the freeze requires a terrifying journey back toward the light of the living. To thaw, the nervous system must reawaken and pass back through the immense rage, terror, and explosive energy that it bypassed when it originally collapsed. This is why so many trauma survivors unconsciously resist healing. The prospect of feeling that massive, trapped energy rushing back into their conscious awareness is horrifying. It feels as though they will be torn apart by the sheer force of their own suppressed vitality. They choose the numb, restrictive prison of the freeze because, however agonizing it may be, it feels safer than the explosive chaos of the thaw. Yet, biology dictates a rigid rule for this healing. As they go in, so they come out. The organism must reverse the exact trajectory it took into the trauma. If an individual entered the freeze while raising their arms to fend off a blow, the trapped energy is locked specifically in the musculature of the arms and shoulders. To resolve the trauma, the nervous system must be gently guided to complete that specific defensive movement. The arms must be allowed to push away the invisible phantom of the past. If the freeze occurred while the legs were desperately trying to run, the physical sensation of running must be instinctively completed. This is not a cognitive exercise of remembering the event. It is a profound physiological completion of a thwarted instinct. Until that specific, interrupted biological action is allowed to fulfill its purpose, the organism will remain locked in a perpetual state of suspended animation, waiting for a resolution that the rational mind refuses to permit. The devastation of this uncompleted cycle is rarely the result of a single monumental catastrophe. For most human beings, the descent into trauma is a cumulative effect. We navigate a modern world filled with relentless, unnatural stressors, sudden, loud noises, minor collisions, surgical procedures, and emotional abandonments. Because we have lost the cultural permission to routinely discharge our instinctual responses, each of these unresolved micro-threats deposits a small residue of trapped survival energy into our nervous system. Over years and decades, these deposits accumulate like pressure building within a sealed fault line. Eventually, the reservoir of suppressed energy becomes so immense that even a seemingly trivial event, a harsh word from a stranger or a sudden change in plans, can act as the final trigger, causing the entire system to fracture. This is the exact mechanism of how biology becomes pathology. The instinctual survival mechanisms that were flawlessly designed by nature to protect our lives are turned against us by our own rational minds. The undischarged energy does not simply evaporate, it ferments. It mutates into the devastating symptoms of trauma, wreaking havoc on our immune systems, distorting our perceptions of reality and alienating us from our own bodies. We become exiles in our own skin, tormented by the ghost of a survival response that was never allowed to finish its task. Yet the energy that torments us is the very same life force that can heal us. The key to our liberation lies in coaxing the frightened animal within us to finally complete its journey, to shed the ice of the freeze and to reclaim the vibrant, moving current of life. Chapter 5. Thawing the Freeze, the Art of Renegotiation. To comprehend the profound mechanics of healing, we must return to the story of Nancy, the woman who vanquished her debilitating agoraphobia by physically fleeing an imaginary tiger in her therapist's office. Her sudden, explosive, recovery was not a miraculous anomaly, nor was it the result of profound psychological insight. Nancy's breakthrough was a perfect, crystalline demonstration of the biological thaw. When she was 3 years old, pinned beneath the terrifying grip of strangers and suffocated by an ether mask, her nervous system had flooded her body with a colossal surge of survival energy. Denied the physical ability to fight or run, her organism collapsed into the freeze, locking that massive energetic charge deep within her musculature. For decades, her panic attacks were not a psychological weakness. They were the desperate, thrashing attempts of that trapped energy trying to find a way out. By finally executing the physical movements of running away, by allowing her legs to thrash and her body to violently tremble, Nancy did not merely remember her past. She fundamentally altered her nervous system's relationship to it. She completed the thwarted instinctual action, and in doing so, she discharged the trapped terror. This brings us to a radical, liberating truth about the nature of human suffering. It is all fundamentally a matter of energy. The lingering devastation of a traumatic event is not ultimately about the specific horrifying details of what happened. The nervous system does not care whether the threat was a charging predator, a violent collision, or an abusive childhood environment. It only knows that it mobilized a massive, highly potent chemical and electrical charge designed to ensure survival. This survival energy is neither inherently good nor inherently bad. It is simply a raw, natural force, much like electricity or water. When it is allowed to flow fluidly through the organism, it provides us with our vitality, our boundaries, and our zest for life. But when it's abruptly halted and denied expression, it becomes trapped. This imprisoned vitality ferments. It becomes the invisible fuel that powers chronic pain, explosive rage, paralyzing depression, and severe anxiety. Healing, therefore, is not a process of endlessly analyzing the past, but of safely managing and releasing this unspent fuel in the present. Consider the experience of Marius, a man who survived a devastating rear-end automobile collision. In the terrifying fraction of a second before the impact, Marius saw the approaching car in his rearview mirror. Instinctively, his shoulders hiked up toward his ears, his hands clamped down onto the steering wheel with crushing force, and his breath stopped in his chest. He survived the crash, but years later he remained a prisoner of his own body. He suffered from agonizing, relentless neck pain, severe migraines, and a terrifying tendency to flinch violently whenever someone walked up behind him. His biology had crystallized into pathology. To thaw this profound freeze, Marius did not need to sit in a chair and emotionally relive the horror of the accident. Reliving the event would have only flooded his system with the exact same terror, reinforcing the trauma. Instead, he needed to address the massive, frozen kinetic energy locked in his neck, shoulders, and arms. He needed a way to safely discharge the tension of that interrupted defensive brace. The distinction between reliving a trauma and renegotiating it is the most critical boundary in the landscape of healing. When an individual simply relives a horrific memory, they are pulled backward into the vortex of the past, overwhelmed by the original terror, and left re-traumatized by the sheer magnitude of the unmanaged emotion. Renegotiation, on the other hand, is a deeply grounded present-moment experience. It is the art of encountering the trapped survival energy while remaining firmly anchored in the safety of the here and now. In renegotiation, the individual does not fall back into the abyss. They stand at its edge, fully resourced, and carefully dismantle the terror, piece by piece. This dismantling requires a profound respect for the organism's delicate capacity. The process must be undertaken through gradated renegotiation, a method that is the beating heart of somatic experiencing. If we were to suddenly open the floodgates and attempt to release decades of trapped survival energy all at once, the nervous system would violently short-circuit. The resulting panic would drive the individual right back into the paralyzing safety of the freeze. To heal safely, we must introduce the trapped energy to the conscious mind drop by microscopic drop. Imagine a glass of water deeply clouded with dark, heavy ink. If you attempt to tip the glass and pour the ink out all at once, you risk dropping and shattering the glass entirely. However, if you place the glass beneath a tap and allow pure, clear water to drip in, one drop at a time, the dark ink is slowly, gently displaced. Eventually, the water runs completely clear. In somatic experiencing, this clear water is the resource. Before an individual ever touches the edge of their traumatic memory, they must first establish a felt sense of absolute safety and strength within their physical body. This resource might be the feeling of their feet planted firmly on the solid ground, the rhythmic comforting rise and fall of their breath, or the memory of a deeply loving presence that brings a sensation of warmth to their chest. Once this physical anchor is established, the individual is invited to gently touch the very periphery of the traumatic activation, perhaps just noticing a slight tightening in the jaw or a faint flutter in the stomach. The moment this tiny drop of activation is felt, the process is immediately paused, and the individual's awareness is guided back to the physical sensation of the resource. This gentle, rhythmic pendulum swing between safety and a tiny drop of activation is the essence of thawing. As the individual moves back and forth, the nervous system begins to realize that the danger is no longer absolute. The trapped energy begins to loosen. In the case of Marius, as he engaged in this gradated process, his body began to take over. Anchored in the present moment, he noticed a subtle, trembling heat building in his forearms. Without forcing it, his hands began to make slow, involuntary, microscopic pushing motions. His body was finally being allowed to complete the action of pushing away the steering wheel, the exact defensive movement that had been violently interrupted years before. As his hands pushed through the invisible resistance, a profound, full-bodied shudder rippled through his spine. The chronic, agonizing tension in his neck began to melt. The elements of successful renegotiation always culminate in these physical signs of discharge. As the thwarted instinctual responses are finally allowed to complete their cycle, the body responds with involuntary trembling, spontaneous deep breaths, waves of warmth, or even quiet, restorative tears. The organism is shedding the heavy, suffocating armor of the freeze. It is a biological homecoming. By honoring the slow, careful rhythm of gradated renegotiation, we do not just survive our most agonizing experiences, we reclaim the immense vital energy that was stolen from us in the dark. We step out of the frozen wasteland of the past and return, fully alive, to the flowing current of the present. Chapter 6. The core, reactions, and symptoms of trauma. In the natural world, the biological rhythm of survival is a perfectly balanced pendulum. When danger appears, the nervous system swings upward into a state of intense arousal, flooding the organism with the necessary adrenaline and energy to secure its safety. Once the threat has passed, the pendulum naturally swings back down. The body discharges the excess tension, the heart rate slows, and the organism returns to a state of restful equilibrium. What goes up must inevitably come down. This is the unbreakable law of a healthy nervous system. However, when an overwhelming event interrupts this natural descent, the pendulum becomes stuck at the apex of its arc. The immense survival energy cannot dissipate, and the cycle remains radically incomplete. The rational mind often attempts to minimize this physical entrapment by comparing traumas, assuming that a massive catastrophe must produce a worse reaction than a seemingly minor incident. We desperately try to categorize our pain, believing that a survivor of war is entitled to their suffering, while someone who endured a routine but terrifying childhood surgery should simply shake it off. But the primitive instinctual brain does not possess a hierarchy of suffering. It does not measure the external narrative or weigh the social validity of the threat. To the nervous system, trauma is trauma, no matter what caused it. Whether the catalyst was an earthquake, a sudden betrayal, a fall from a bicycle, or prolonged emotional neglect, if the organism perceives a threat to its existence and is unable to physically complete its defensive response, the resulting physiological chaos is virtually identical. When the pendulum of arousal is suspended and the biological loop remains open, 4 distinct core reactions weave themselves into the fabric of the nervous system. These are the foundational pillars of the traumatic state, and the first among them is hyperarousal. Because the survival energy was never discharged, the body remains in a perpetual state of red alert. The autonomic nervous system acts as if the life-threatening event is still occurring, pumping out stress hormones long after the external danger has vanished. This creates a relentless, exhausting internal buzz. The individual becomes hypervigilant, constantly scanning their environment for hidden threats, startling violently at ordinary noises, and suffering from a racing mind that refuses to quiet down. It is the agonizing sensation of having an accelerator pedal pressed firmly to the floorboard, driving the engine of the body to the absolute point of burning out. This massive internal acceleration is immediately countered by the second core reaction: constriction. Just as the body braces for a physical blow by clenching its muscles, the traumatized organism constricts its tissues to contain the overwhelming surge of hyperarousal. This bracing is entirely involuntary. It alters the rhythm of the breath, turning deep, vital inhalations into shallow, rapid gasps. It tightens the digestive tract, narrows the blood vessels, and locks the musculature of the neck, back, and shoulders into a state of rigid armor. This physical constriction is accompanied by a profound narrowing of perception. The individual loses their peripheral vision, both literally and metaphorically, becoming hyper-focused on the source of their anxiety while losing the ability to see the broader, safer context of their lives. As the battle between hyperarousal and constriction escalates, the internal pressure becomes completely unbearable. To survive this agonizing friction, the organism deploys its third core reaction: dissociation. This is nature's ultimate anesthetic. When the physical and emotional pain of the trapped energy becomes too immense for the conscious mind to endure, the nervous system severs the connection between the self and the body. The individual uncouples from their physical sensations, floating away into a hazy, numbed detachment. They may feel as though they are observing their own life from a distance, watching a movie rather than living inside their own skin. While dissociation offers vital, immediate relief from unbearable terror, remaining in this severed state long-term leaves the individual feeling hollow, disconnected from their loved ones, and entirely exiled from the vibrant sensations of joy and presence. The final pillar of the traumatic core is a profound, suffocating helplessness. This is not a psychological attitude or a conscious choice to play the victim. It is a physiological collapse. During the original event, the organism's intense desire to fight or flee was totally thwarted, resulting in a physical realization that no action could secure safety. This biological defeat embeds itself deeply within the tissues. The nervous system learns that action is futile, breeding a heavy, leaden paralysis. The traumatized individual may rationally know what they need to do to improve their life, yet they find themselves inexplicably trapped beneath an invisible, crushing weight, entirely unable to mobilize their own will. These 4 core reactions, hyperarousal, constriction, dissociation, and helplessness, form the subterranean roots from which a vast and bewildering array of traumatic symptoms grow. The trapped energy, constantly searching for a way to express itself, morphs into a myriad of physical and emotional afflictions. Sleep becomes a battleground of insomnia and night terrors as the hyper-aroused brain refuses to surrender to the vulnerability of rest. The chronic physical constriction gives birth to severe migraines, digestive disorders, fibromyalgia, and a host of psychosomatic pains that confound traditional medical diagnoses. The underlying helplessness and dissociation manifest as profound depressions, debilitating phobias, sudden, explosive panic attacks, and severe mood swings that feel entirely unprovoked. Tragically, these symptoms do not exist in isolation. They feed upon one another, creating a terrifying, self-sustaining vortex. and around we go. The sensation of a suddenly racing heart, a symptom of hyperarousal, terrifies the individual, which causes them to brace and constrict their breathing. This constriction restricts oxygen, simulating the feeling of suffocation, which instantly triggers the deep physiological memory of helplessness. To escape this terrifying feeling of collapse, the mind dissociates, leaving the individual feeling disconnected and out of control, which in turn spikes their terror and throws them right back into extreme hyperarousal. It is a vicious, endless loop, a dark carousel that the survivor feels powerless to stop. The harder they fight the symptoms, the more tightly the trap closes around them. To step out of this destructive loop, we must undergo a radical shift in perspective. We must recognize that the bewildering symptoms of trauma are not the enemy, nor are they evidence of a broken mind or a failing body. They are the desperate, codified language of an organism trying to heal itself. The migraines, the panic, the numbing fatigue, these are the cries of the trapped survival energy begging for a safe avenue of release. Healing requires us to stop fighting the symptoms directly and instead address the subterranean core. By gently accessing the felt sense, carefully thawing the constriction and honoring the biological need to discharge the hyperarousal, we uncouple the cycle of terror. We gently invite the dissociated spirit back into the living flesh, transforming the heavy lead of helplessness into the vibrant, flowing gold of reclaimed vitality. Chapter 7. The reality of the traumatized person and the compulsion to repeat. Living with unresolved trauma is akin to navigating a landscape where the air is eternally thick with the promise of a devastating storm, yet the sky remains completely clear. For the traumatized individual, the danger is no longer an external event occurring in the present moment. It has become an invisible, internalized reality. They are locked in a desperate, exhausting battle against a threat that simply cannot be found. Because the nervous system remains suspended in a state of high alert, the brain loses its natural ability to accurately interpret the environment. A harmless shadow, a sudden change in tone of voice, or the innocent squeal of tires on pavement are not processed as ordinary events. Instead, they are instantly interpreted as impending doom. This distorted perception creates a profound inability to synthesize new information. The organism is so consumed by its ancient survival mandate that it cannot learn from new, safe experiences. It cannot register the profound truth that the war is over. This tragic misinterpretation of reality is fueled by a mechanism known as traumatic coupling. During a terrifying ordeal, the brain indiscriminately records every sensory detail present in the environment. The exact smell of the room, the specific angle of the light, the color of a shirt, or the subtle shift in the temperature. These neutral, entirely harmless elements become violently fused together with the intense physiological terror of the event. They are coupled. Years later, an individual might walk into a bakery and be suddenly overwhelmed by a debilitating panic attack, completely unaware that the faint scent of a specific cleaning product used in the shop is the exact same scent that was present during a childhood abuse incident. To the rational mind, the panic makes absolutely no sense. But to the primitive nervous system, that scent is not a memory. It is an active, blaring alarm bell announcing that death is imminent. Consider the case of Mrs. Thayer, a woman who lived her entire life anticipating disaster. She possessed a brilliant, analytical mind, yet she was perpetually paralyzed by a pervasive, agonizing anxiety. Her nervous system was constantly preparing for a catastrophic blow that never seemed to land. Through careful somatic exploration, it was revealed that her profound hypervigilance was tied to a severe early childhood fall. The overwhelming shock of that impact had never been discharged. Consequently, her entire reality was filtered through the lens of a frightened, braced child, perpetually waiting for the ground to vanish from beneath her feet. This chronic helplessness is a hallmark of the traumatized reality. It is a heavy, leaden despair that settles deep into the bones, convincing the individual that no amount of effort, no change in circumstance, and no rational understanding will ever be enough to secure their safety. To survive this agonizing, relentless internal pressure, the human psyche often constructs a powerful shield of denial. Denial is not merely a conscious refusal to admit the truth. It is a profound biological dampening of reality. It is the organism's way of wrapping the unbearable pain in thick layers of cotton. An individual named Gladys perfectly exemplified this protective mechanism. She presented herself to the world with a bright, unfailing cheerfulness, insisting that her life was wonderful and that a severely abusive childhood had left absolutely no lasting marks on her spirit. Yet beneath this brittle, forced optimism, her physical body told a drastically different story. She suffered from a cascade of severe, migrating psychosomatic symptoms, chronic back pain, digestive failures, and strange, numbing sensations in her limbs. The energy she expended to maintain her fortress of denial required a massive portion of her vital life force, leaving her physically depleted and emotionally hollow. Her denial protected her from the acute terror of the past, but it demanded her vibrant, authentic connection to the present as payment. When the internal reality is defined by unacknowledged pain and trapped survival energy, the organism does not simply remain stagnant. It actively, unconsciously seeks a way out. This desperate search for resolution creates one of the most bewildering and destructive phenomena of trauma, the blueprint for repetition. It is a tragic irony that individuals who have survived horrific, life-threatening experiences frequently find themselves drawn back into remarkably similar, dangerous situations. They repeatedly engage in abusive relationships, gravitate toward hazardous professions, or suffer a statistically impossible number of severe accidents. To the outside observer, it appears as though the individual is self-destructive, a glutton for punishment, or perhaps simply cursed by terrible luck. The truth is far more profound and deeply rooted in biology. The organism is not seeking to destroy itself. It is desperately attempting to heal. The nervous system remembers the thwarted, incomplete defensive response that occurred during the original trauma. Because that biological cycle remains open, the organism unconsciously orchestrates situations that mimic the original threat, hoping that this time it will be able to successfully fight, flee, or defend itself. This is the phenomenon of reenactment. It is the body staging a desperate, high-stakes play, endlessly repeating the first act in the blind hope of finally discovering a new ending. These patterns of shock can manifest in incredibly precise, almost eerie ways. Consider the phenomenon of anniversary reactions. An individual might experience a sudden, inexplicable bout of severe depression, intense physical pain, or a terrifying surge of anxiety every year around the 5th of July or precisely at 6:30 in the morning. The conscious mind may have completely forgotten the significance of the date or time, but the body keeps a flawless microscopic score. The cells remember the exact moment the original trauma occurred, and as the anniversary approaches, the trapped energy rises to the surface, demanding to be seen and resolved. We see this compulsion to repeat clearly in the story of Jack, a man who suffered a series of devastating high-speed motorcycle crashes. After surviving his first near-fatal accident, Jack did not develop a cautious reverence for the road. Instead, as soon as his physical wounds had superficially healed, he found himself overwhelmed by an intense, restless compulsion to ride even faster, pushing the boundaries of safety to the absolute limit. Inevitably, he crashed again. Jack was not suicidal. He was caught in the powerful, unconscious grip of reenactment. During his first crash, his nervous system had mobilized a massive surge of adrenaline to survive the impact, but that energy was never safely discharged. By repeatedly thrusting himself back into extreme danger, his body was attempting to recreate the exact physiological conditions of the original terror, hoping to finally complete the thwarted biological response and shake off the freeze. Without conscious awareness, we have absolutely no choice but to remain prisoners of this blueprint. Blind reenactment is a dangerous, often lethal gamble. When an individual unconsciously repeats their trauma, without the necessary internal resources or a safe, supportive container. They do not heal. They simply fail again, plunging deeper into the abyss of helplessness and reinforcing the original wound. They are re-traumatized. The crucial difference between reenactment and true healing lies entirely in the presence of awareness. Renegotiation, the safe biological thawing of the freeze, requires the individual to step out of the blind compulsion to repeat the past, and instead enter the quiet, observant theater of the body. In this somatic theater, we do not need to orchestrate external disasters to heal. We can gently invite the memory of the trauma into our conscious awareness, while remaining deeply anchored in the present moment. By tracking the subtle physical sensations, the sudden tightening of the chest, the heat rising in the face, the impulse to run, we allow the body to finally execute its ancient, interrupted survival script. We provide the awareness that was missing in the dark. These patterns of shock echo far back into our personal histories, rippling across time and space, dictating our choices and narrowing our lives. But when we illuminate the biological compulsion to repeat with the gentle, unwavering light of present moment awareness, the cycle is broken. The phantom threat vanishes, the coupled terrors are unlinked, and the organism is finally granted permission to rest. Chapter 8. The Path to Personal Transformation. Trauma possesses a dual nature, presenting two entirely distinct faces to the world. One face is a mask of unimaginable suffering, a relentless destroyer of joy, connection, and vitality. It is the face that locks individuals into a paralyzing cycle of fear and physical pain, diminishing their world until it is no larger than the boundaries of their own terror. Yet, there is another face. When the trapped survival energy is safely accessed and the biological cycle is allowed to complete itself, trauma reveals itself as one of the most potent catalysts for profound personal metamorphosis. The very forces that possess the power to shatter a life also hold the extraordinary potential to forge a deeper, more resilient and fiercely vibrant human spirit. This is the alchemy of the healing journey. It is not a path of merely enduring the damage, but of utilizing the intense heat of the traumatic experience to burn away the rigid armor of the past, awakening a profound instinctual wisdom that most people never access. In navigating this journey, we frequently find ourselves torn between two extreme landscapes. On one side lies the agonizing hell of our unresolved wounds, the daily battle with panic, depression, and somatic affliction. Desperate to escape this torment, many seekers attempt to leap directly to the other extreme, a state of transcendent, heavenly perfection. They pursue relentless spiritual practices or adopt rigid philosophies of positive thinking, hoping to bypass the messy, agonizing reality of their pain. But this leap is an illusion. We cannot transcend the physical body by ignoring its cries. The true path to healing requires a middle ground. This middle ground is the physical organism itself, the living, breathing, pulsing vessel that holds both our deepest terrors and our greatest capacity for joy. By anchoring our awareness in the gentle, rhythmic reality of the body, we create a sacred bridge between the underworld of our trauma and the expansive sky of our freedom. To cross this bridge, we must surrender to the biological imperative of letting the energy flow. This is the essence of renegotiation. It is a profound shift from fighting our physical sensations to actively cooperating with them. When we allow the body to express the tiny, incremental movements of its thwarted defense, the subtle urge to push, to run, or to finally take a deep, unrestricted breath, we open the floodgates. The nervous system begins to unwind. It is not a process of aggressively digging up the past, but of creating a hospitable environment in the present moment where the trapped survival energy feels safe enough to finally melt. Consider the experience of a woman named Margaret, who sought relief from a lifetime of severe, unexplained pelvic pain and chronic anxiety. Traditional medical interventions had failed her, and years of psychological analysis had provided insight, but no physical relief. During her somatic exploration, her body began to exhibit intense, involuntary trembling in her lower extremities, followed by a terrifying feeling of being paralyzed and pinned down. as she was guided to stay present with the physical sensation of the trembling rather than the terror of the paralysis. Her legs suddenly initiated a powerful kicking motion. It was a fierce, instinctual defense mechanism. She was not instructed to analyze the movement. She was simply encouraged to let it flow. As the physical kicking reached its natural conclusion, a massive wave of heat and release washed over her body, and her chronic pelvic pain vanished. In the aftermath of such a profound release, the rational mind immediately demands to know what really happened. Margaret had no conscious memory of an assault or a specific trauma that would warrant such a violent physical defense. Her intellect wanted a clear, historical narrative to justify the biological reaction, but demanding a literal explanation from the organism is a profound misunderstanding of how the body records trauma. The distinction between a blind reenactment of the past and a conscious renegotiation in the present does not rely on uncovering the exact historical truth. Renegotiation relies entirely on resolving the energetic truth held within the tissues. The nervous system does not require a flawless, sequential narrative to heal. It only requires the permission to complete the physical action that was left undone. To grasp why the historical narrative is often elusive, we must fundamentally dismantle our cultural understanding of what memory actually is. We have been taught to view the brain as a sophisticated video camera, perfectly recording the events of our lives onto a pristine tape that can be rewound and played back on demand. This is a fallacy. Memory is not a static recording. It is a highly fluid, fragmented, and state-dependent phenomenon. When an individual is subjected to overwhelming terror, the rational, narrative centers of the brain essentially shut down. The massive influx of adrenaline and cortisol prevents the experience from being stored as a coherent story. Instead, the memory is shattered into thousands of sensory fragments. It is stored as the smell of damp earth, a sudden blinding light, an agonizing pressure in the chest, or a phantom suffocating inability to breathe. Because these fragments are encoded by the primitive nonverbal brain, they are retrieved not as coherent thoughts but as visceral physical sensations. When the body begins to thaw and discharge these sensory fragments during healing, the rational mind is often flooded with terrifying, disjointed images. The individual might suddenly see a vision of a horrifying monster or experience the acute sensation of a knife tearing into their flesh. They will inevitably cry out that the experience seems incredibly real, convinced that they are uncovering a literal suppressed memory of a horrific crime. However, these sensory explosions are rarely literal. The body is simply using the most extreme dramatic metaphors it can conjure to express the sheer, unfathomable magnitude of the survival energy it is releasing. If we mistake these biological metaphors for literal, historical facts, we risk creating devastating false memories, entirely missing the profound physical healing that is taking place beneath the imagery. Navigating this terrain requires immense care, especially when we confront the powerful identities we construct around our pain. Many individuals, having clawed their way out of the darkest depths of their trauma, proudly claim the title of survivor. This label is often a vital, empowering stepping stone. It marks a triumphant transition from helpless victimhood to a state of acknowledged endurance. But clinging too tightly to the identity of the survivor can eventually become a barrier to ultimate transformation. To define oneself perpetually as a survivor is to maintain an identity entirely forged by the traumatic event. It implies a never-ending war, a state of being forever marked by the damage. True transformation demands the courage to eventually lay down the armor of the survivor. It requires us to step into a new, uncharted reality where our identity is no longer dictated by the horrors we endured, but by the vibrant, unbound potential of who we are in the present. This ultimate surrender requires a remarkable courage to feel. We spend our lives building elaborate fortresses of intellect, distraction, and denial to avoid the agonizing vulnerability of our own physical sensations. Yet, the only way out of the fire is through it. We must be willing to sit with the discomfort of the trembling, to honor the profound grief of our physical collapse, and to trust that the biological storm will not destroy us. This courage is not a solitary effort of sheer willpower. It is fueled by a deep, innate desire for wholeness that resides within every living organism. Just as a plant instinctively bends toward the sunlight, the human nervous system is continuously, relentlessly driven toward healing. We do not have to invent the cure. We simply have to stop obstructing the body's natural, powerful desire to restore its own balance. Yet this biological imperative cannot reach its full potential in isolation. The wounds of trauma frequently sever our connection to the human family, leaving us stranded on an island of solitary terror. To safely navigate the terrifying descent into the physical body, we desperately need a secure, compassionate container. We need the calm, regulated presence of another human being to act as an anchor when the internal storm threatens to pull us under. With a little help from our friends, therapists, and supportive communities, we borrow the strength of their grounded nervous systems. Through this profound shared resonance, we realize that we do not have to face the darkness alone. Supported by the unwavering presence of others, we find the strength to let the tiger awaken, to shed the frozen skin of the past, and to step fully into the transformative light of our own lives. Chapter 9. Healing Society, Transforming Cultural Trauma. When we pull back the lens from the intimately personal struggles of the individual and cast our gaze upon the broader landscape of human history, a dark and perplexing reality emerges. If trauma is, at its core, a biological mechanism of survival that has become thwarted, we must ask what happens when this thwarted energy infects not just a single person, but an entire society. To comprehend the staggering scale of human violence and the deeply embedded wounds within our cultures, we must once again return to the wilderness and observe the natural laws that govern the animal approach to aggression. In the wild, aggression is an undeniable reality, yet it is fundamentally a life-serving force. It is utilized to establish territory, secure resources, and maintain the complex hierarchies that allow a species to thrive. When two wolves clash for dominance, the battle is fierce, but it rarely ends in death. The moment one wolf recognizes it is outmatched, it will roll over and expose its vulnerable throat in a clear signal of absolute surrender. This instinctual gesture of submission instantly triggers an equally powerful instinct in the victor. The dominant wolf halts its attack immediately. Nature has brilliantly programmed these creatures with a biological braking system, ensuring that intraspecies aggression remains a tool for survival rather than an instrument of annihilation. Human aggression, however, paints a tragically different picture. We are the only species on Earth capable of unleashing boundless, calculated destruction upon our own kind. When an enemy surrenders, we do not inherently possess an instinctual mechanism that forces us to stop our assault. Instead, human history is stained with the blood of endless wars, genocides, and systematic cruelty. The reason for this devastating divergence lies deeply rooted in our severed relationship with our own instinctual bodies. Because we have alienated ourselves from our primal bodily wisdom through the overdevelopment of our rational minds, our aggressive impulses are no longer bounded by the natural rhythms of tension and release. Instead, our aggression becomes detached from its biological purpose. It morphs from a necessary, temporary defense mechanism into a chronic, ideological weapon fueled by the immense reservoir of trapped survival energy left behind by unhealed trauma. To truly grapple with the darkest aspects of our nature, we must ask a profoundly uncomfortable question. Why do humans kill, maim, and torture one another with such deliberate malice? The answer lies hidden in the terrifying mechanics of the freeze response. When an individual, or an entire culture, is subjected to prolonged, overwhelming terror and chronic helplessness, the massive energy mobilized for self-defense is driven deeply inward. The organism is completely frozen, yet silently boiling with unexpressed rage and the desperate, thwarted desire to fight. When this trapped explosive energy ferments over years and generations without any avenue for natural discharge, it twists the human psyche. The individual becomes so suffocated by their own internal paralysis that they unconsciously seek to externalize the terror. Torture and sadistic violence are tragically the organism's severely distorted attempts to feel alive and powerful again. By inflicting absolute helplessness upon another human being, the perpetrator is unconsciously trying to discharge their own unbearable frozen energy. They are desperately attempting to break their own paralysis by watching someone else shatter. This dynamic creates an endless, self-replicating circle of trauma, the victim infused with the horrifying energy of the abuser and trapped in their own subsequent freeze, often unwittingly becomes the perpetrator of tomorrow. We see this devastating cycle continuously playing out across the globe, not only in the intimate tragedies of generational child abuse, but on the grand geopolitical stage. Entire nations, forged in the fires of historical oppression and mass trauma, construct their cultural identities around their victimhood. Their unresolved collective terror shapes their political policies, their defensive postures, and their relationships with neighboring nations. Driven by the unconscious compulsion to reenact the past, cultures continuously clash, projecting their undischarged survival energy onto new enemies. The war is never truly about the territory or the ideology of the present. It is a blind, violent repetition of a biological shock that occurred centuries ago. Yet, as terrifying as this reality may be, we are not permanently condemned to this destructive loop. Just as the individual possesses the innate capacity to thaw their frozen energy, societies possess the power to break the generational chains of violence. We can transform the vicious circle of trauma into a circle of grace. Grace, in the somatic sense, is the profound state of flow and profound connection that emerges when trapped energy is finally liberated. When an individual courageously turns inward, confronts their own somatic landscape, and successfully renegotiates their trauma, they perform a radical act of societal healing. By discharging the violent energy held within their own tissues, they refuse to pass the burden onto their children. They break the link. With every person who reclaims their instinctual vitality, the collective weight of human trauma is incrementally lightened, shifting the global pendulum away from destruction and toward profound, empathetic connection. Transforming cultural trauma demands a monumental paradigm shift in how we structure our societies. We must move away from systems that rely on punitive violence and isolation, which only serve to deepen the freeze and perpetuate the cycle of rage. Instead, our communities, our educational systems, and our institutions must become conscious containers for healing. We must foster environments that recognize the biological reality of trauma, environments that do not demand stoic silence in the face of suffering, but instead offer the safety, the warmth, and the collective support necessary for individuals to tremble, weep, and discharge their pain. We must restore the communal rituals of grief and recovery that our ancestors instinctively understood. By doing so, we begin to weave a new cultural fabric, one that honors the vulnerability of the physical body rather than exploiting it. We currently stand at the precipice of the 11th hour. The stakes have never been higher. Driven by the relentless innovation of our rational minds, we have developed technological weapons of unfathomable, world-ending power. Yet, our emotional and biological evolution has not kept pace. We possess the weaponry of gods, but we are still operating with the dysregulated, traumatized nervous systems of frightened prey. If we allow our unresolved collective trauma to continue dictating our actions, if we remain blind to the desperate biological forces driving our conflicts, the result will undoubtedly be a tragic epitaph for the human race. We will simply annihilate ourselves in a final blind reenactment of our unhealed terror. However, nature is no fool. The evolutionary development of the human neocortex, the very brain that has so often trapped us in the freeze by overriding our instincts, is not a biological mistake. It is an instrument of unparalleled potential. Nature has given us the capacity for conscious awareness, the ability to observe our own internal states, and the power to willfully choose a different path. The neocortex does not have to be the enemy of the instinctual body. It can become its greatest ally. When we use our conscious awareness not to suppress our physical nature, but to gently guide and witness the profound thawing of our trauma, we step into a new echelon of human evolution. We have the choice to write a magnificent epilogue. By healing the deep wounds of our biological past, we can awaken from the nightmare of endless violence, integrating the brilliant intellect of our minds with the ancient enduring wisdom of our bodies to create a world defined not by survival, but by true, vibrant, and peaceful existence. Chapter 10. Emotional First Aid, healing our children and ourselves. The sudden, jarring violence of an automobile accident or a severe fall thrusts the human organism into an immediate state of profound shock. In these critical, chaotic moments immediately following an impact, the actions we take can mean the difference between a temporary fright and a lifelong traumatic affliction. When the twisted metal settles or the body hits the ground, the most crucial first step is often entirely counterintuitive to our modern, fast-paced conditioning. We must do absolutely nothing. Unless there is an immediate, life-threatening danger such as a fire or oncoming traffic, the victim should not be rushed into movement. The nervous system requires precious time to orient to the shocking new reality. Rushing an accident victim to immediately stand up, brush themselves off, and declare that they are fine violently interrupts the body's natural entry into shock, prematurely freezing the massive energy of the impact. Instead, the victim should remain still, allowing the initial waves of adrenaline to wash over them, while the responder provides a calm, grounded, and reassuring physical presence. Once the individual has been safely moved to a hospital or their home, the real work of emotional first aid begins. The sterile, glaring environment of an emergency room is inherently terrifying to the primitive brain. To counter this, the victim must actively seek internal resources of safety, perhaps focusing on the feeling of a loved one's hand or the solid support of the hospital bed beneath them. As the immediate shock begins to wear off in the ensuing hours or days, the trapped kinetic energy of the crash will inevitably attempt to find a way out. This is the crucial phase of accessing and renegotiating the trauma. The individual must gently bring their awareness to the physical sensations in their body. They may begin to feel a spontaneous trembling, a sudden rush of heat, or an uncontrollable urge to weep. It is paramount that these biological discharges are welcomed and allowed to run their full course without interference from the rational mind. As the thawing deepens, the organism must eventually process the exact physical moment of impact. During a high-speed collision, the body braces against forces far greater than itself, locking a massive amount of unspent defensive energy into the musculature. To release this, the individual can mentally revisit the final fraction of a second before the crash, carefully maintaining their awareness on their present physical safety. By slowly, deliberately allowing the body to execute the physical motions of bracing, pushing, or twisting away from the phantom blow, the nervous system completes its thwarted defense. The violent kinetic energy of the collision is drained from the tissues, preventing the accident from hardening into a chronic physical pathology. This somatic approach to first aid is even more critical when caring for the most vulnerable members of our human family, our children. A child's nervous system is immensely resilient, yet fiercely delicate. They do not possess the adult capacity to rationalize a terrifying event. A routine tumble from a bicycle, a sudden dog bite, or a frightening medical procedure can trigger a profound physiological freeze. Tragically, adults often miss the signs of childhood trauma because the symptoms do not always appear immediately. A child might endure a severe fall and seemingly walk away completely unscathed, only to develop intense night terrors, behavioral regression, or severe stomach aches weeks or even months later. This delayed traumatic reaction occurs because the child's organism initially suppressed the terror to survive, slowly leaking the trapped energy into their daily life long after the precipitating event has been forgotten by the adults around them. Recognizing the silent cries of a traumatized child requires careful, quiet observation. The most profound language a child possesses is the language of play. When a child is burdened by unresolved shock, their play loses its joyful, spontaneous creativity. It becomes rigid, repetitive, and deeply anxious. Consider the case history of a young boy named Sammy, who suffered a terrifying near-drowning incident. In the aftermath, Sammy became intensely withdrawn and developed a severe, debilitating fear of water. His parents noticed that his daily play had become a dark, endless reenactment of the trauma. He would repeatedly crash his toy boats together, sinking them to the bottom of a pretend ocean, leaving his toy figures trapped and helpless. He was caught in a blueprint for repetition, his nervous system desperately trying to find a resolution to the terror, but repeatedly failing. To guide a child out of this traumatic loop, adults must participate in this play, gently steering it toward a triumphant renegotiation. When Sammy sank his boats, a knowledgeable adult intervened, not by stopping the game, but by introducing a rescue helicopter to safely pluck the drowning figures from the water. By physically acting out a successful, victorious conclusion to the terrifying scenario, Sammy's nervous system was given the completion it desperately craved. Key principles for renegotiating trauma with children hinge on this absolute validation of their physical reality. We must never tell a child that a medical needle will not hurt or that they are too big to cry after a fall. We must validate their fear, provide a fiercely protective physical container, and allow their little bodies to tremble, cry, and shake out the shock. When a child is permitted to fully express their biological response to a threat, they do not remain broken. They bounce back with a profound, enduring resilience. Ultimately, whether we are soothing a frightened child or thawing the deeply entrenched traumas of our own adult lives, the destination of this healing journey remains the same. We are striving to heal the profound fracture within our own biology. Inside the human skull reside 3 distinct evolutionary brains: the ancient instinctual reptilian core, the emotional mammalian center, and the towering rational neocortex. Trauma thrives in the catastrophic division of these 3 vital forces. It occurs when the rational brain judges and suffocates the primitive instincts, leaving the organism fragmented and at war with itself. But when we engage in the courageous work of somatic renegotiation, we bridge this agonizing divide. We teach the brilliant analytical neocortex to bow in respectful cooperation with the ancient sensing body. In this sacred reunion, the 3 brains cease their battling and merge into one unified, extraordinary mind. We awaken the tiger within, shedding the heavy chains of our past terrors and stepping fully into the magnificent, flowing current of a truly embodied human life.